This is Finding Peace in Somalia, the Galkaio Local Agreement. My name is Dr. Matt Benson, and I'm the Research Director for South Sudan within the Conflict Research Program at the LSE, and I'll be chairing today. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the CRP, we work in 5 countries, which are Iraq, Syria, DRC, South Sudan, and Somalia, and we are funded by the FCDO, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, which was formerly DFID. We have a really great topic on the table today, which illuminates the Galkaio Peace Agreement in Somalia. One of the thematic areas within the CRP across the different countries is so-called local agreements. A policy brief on this agreement is available on our website, and an article is in its final stages. The format for today's event will be the main presentation, which will be about 15 to 20 minutes, followed by a short response by each of our 3 panelists. Then we'll turn to a question and answer where you, the audience, can pose questions through the chat function. The event is being recorded today, so it'll also be available later on. And if I can now introduce our panelists in the order in which they're speaking, we have Dr. Nisar Majid, who is the Research Director for the CRP in Somalia. He's worked in and on Somalia-related issues for over 20 years in varying research capacities and is the co-author of the book Famine in Somalia, 2011 to 12, Competing Imperatives, Collective Failures. We're also delighted to have Ms. Ilham Gassar with us. She is the CEO of KIGS Consulting. She's currently a Senior Stabilization and Conflict Advisor to the International Organization for Migration, IOM. Prior to this, she served with the UN Assistance Mission to Somalia, UNISOM, and as a political advisor to the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Somalia, the SRSG. Ilham was also the chief negotiator of the Galkaio Peace Agreement and chief facilitator for the Alha, Sunawa Jama and Galmudug State Power Sharing Agreement. And next we have Khalif Abdirahman, who is a senior field researcher on the CRP Somalia. Khalif and Nisar comprise the core team of the Somalia program. And Khalif has conducted research across the Somali regions in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia over the last 7 years, including for Tufts University, the Rift Valley Institute, RVI, and the Overseas Development Institute, ODI. He's also a fellow of RVI. And finally, we have RVI's very own Mark Bradbury, who is the executive director of the Rift Valley Institute. He's a social analyst with 20 years experience in international development and humanitarian aid. He has worked in and written about Somalia, Somaliland, Sudan, South Sudan, Sierra Leone, Kenya, Uganda, and Kosovo as a development worker and researcher. He's author of the book Becoming Somaliland, as well as Search for Peace, a synthesis report of a peace mapping study on Somalia by Interpeace, and whose peace is it anyway, which connects Somalia and international peacemaking for conciliation resources. So welcome to everyone, and Nisar, it's over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Matt. So I'm going to start by presenting the story of the Galkaio Local Agreement, which was signed in December 2017. The presentation and the policy brief that Matt has mentioned are on our website and are based on a much longer paper that we're currently finalising. And I should say from the outset that this is a joint piece of work. Marika Theros, also from the LSE, and myself have been leading the analysis and writing. Khalif, who's with us, has been intimately involved. And we're grateful to have Ilham here today, who has been the source of many insights on the whole process, as she was a participant in it. And where we've added to her experience and insights with a range of further interviews. So with a couple of caveats to begin with, our angle in this study in the policy brief is particularly around external mediation. So we don't claim to have fully captured all of the dynamics around the building of this agreement, as it took place over several years and had many different elements. And while we're focusing on external mediation, we're not claiming or suggesting that the roles of Interpeace or the SRSG's office, and Ilham herself, as 2 of the main external actors, were the main reason or factor in the success of the agreement. There were many factors, as I've said. However, we do argue that the role of external actors was extremely influential in how the agreement process developed. And this is important to stress in Somalia as in many other places, as external actors are often as much a part of the problem as a part of the solution. And in Somalia in particular, there's a long history of international actors and resources being incorporated into the country's political economy in detrimental ways. I should also say that within the CRP, we don't see Somalia as being on a trajectory towards becoming a normal institutional state. Rather, we utilize Alex Duval's political marketplace framework, where, in short, we see short-term transactional relations, subordinating the building of institutions and norms. There are a number of thematic papers available on our website to this effect, and we're consolidating these into an overall analysis of Somalia at the moment. And the reason I say that is because the deeper reconciliation processes, the rebuilding of social relations, in fact, that have been taking place in and around Galkaio, including through the mediation process, do challenge the expediency and transactional relations of the political marketplace and the associated political deals and bargains that we see elsewhere as part of the federal system and its politics. And the issue for us is that this agreement-making process is the exception rather than the rule of current politics in Somalia. So that said, just turning briefly to the subject of peace building more generally, there's recognized to be a local turn in peace building currently, which emphasizes the need to engage with local actors, structures and dynamics, and which recognizes the changes in the global landscape of conflict and peacemaking over the last 20 to 30 years. Today's armed conflicts are characterized by their complexity, by the proliferation and fragmentation of actors, the mixture of political and criminal violence, intensified geopolitical and regional involvement, and the presence of ideological and identity-based conflict. So while a focus on the local is certainly welcome, it's crucial to understand how local and other levels interact and intersect. And this is certainly the case in many Somali conflicts and political processes. And understanding these layers and how to interact is increasingly urgent for political and diplomatic interventions globally. So I'm just going to turn now to Somalia itself and Galkaio, and I'm going to just very quickly put up a map. So hopefully you can all see that. So this is a map of Somalia. You can see the different federal member states, and on the right-hand side, the northeastern side, you can see Galgaduud and Mudug regions, which together make up Galmudug. And to the north, the regions of Bari and Nugal, and the northern half of Mudug, and then a line in between. That's the area that we're particularly looking at, the border between Puntland and Galmudug. I'm going to come out of that now. If we can just remove that map, please. Okay, so for those of following the collapse of the state in 1990-91 and the civil war, Galkaio town marks a border area where a 1993 peace accord, known as the Mudug Accord, was in fact struck, and which then divided the town for the following 2 decades, and really up to now to a certain extent. This accord was agreed between two of the main protagonists that fought against and brought down the Somalia government of Siad Barre, who were Abdullah Yusuf and General Aidid. And this border area that you've seen in the map has many layers and is one of the most important in the Somali imagination. It divides 2 of the main clan families, the Darod and the Hawiye, as well as their respective local lineages and families. And it's been a long-standing border between Puntland, which was inaugurated as an autonomous region in 1998, and a much more fragmented central and southern Somalia, and which remains to a certain extent the same today. The difference is very significant on either side of this border, as Puntland underwent its own reconciliation process and has functioned as a self-governing region since the late 1990s, since 1998. And this relative stability has in turn attracted significant diaspora investment and an aid presence and resources. North Galkaio, which is the Puntland part of the town, has benefited from these factors, whereas South Galkaio has been much more turbulent as part of its incorporation into southern and central Somalia. So these different political and developmental trajectories on either side of the border have created various imbalances, including a sense of unfairness around access to aid. All or most aid agencies are located in the north of the town, for example. as well as antagonistic language, you might call it superiority and inferiority complexes, and a lack of social interaction across the border. And the 1993 Accord worked reasonably well, reasonably effectively as a truce, mitigating the outbreak of serious conflict, but it didn't involve, crucially, the rebuilding of social relations, which one might argue got worse over time. So that's a bit of background. In 2012, then, Somalia attained international recognition as a federal state, and this required the creation of new regions, or member states as they're called. And it's this process that strained the 1993 Accord, but that ultimately led to a deeper peace process. So while Puntland was already formed as an autonomous region and willingly incorporated into the new federal arrangement, the new member state of Galmudug was created from from 1.5 regions, actually, from Galgaduud region and the southern half of Mudug region. And this created new tensions. Galmudug did not follow the constitutional requirement to be made up of at least 2 regions. It was made up of 1.5 regions. But it also gave Galmudug an equal status to Puntland for the first time. And Puntland was particularly concerned by the close relations between Galmudug's first president and Somalia's president at the time, the national president at the time. So a potential factor that could work against Puntland's interests in the following federal elections. So there were various tensions around. And these tensions at the elite levels, in the capitals of Puntland and Galmudug, the state capitals, and in Mogadishu, were manifest in Galkaio town and were said to be simmering, driven more by outside factors around the state building process, but with a long history of underlying grievances giving easy traction to agitators in the town. And so this resulted eventually in November 2015 in a major outbreak of conflict, and then a ceasefire, and then again in another major outbreak of conflict in October 2016. And the second outbreak of conflict in October 2016 marked the point at which a new concerted effort amongst different actors, including international actors, took place to support a reconciliation process. And that's the subject of this engagement that we're interested in and followed. So there was a lot of attention, of course, at this time internationally around the international support for a new Somalia government, as well as within the wider Somali public, who were hopeful that this signified a new phase in Somalia's political development. So I'll turn to a number of points now that I'd like to highlight that we find significant when looking at the local peace process from a kind of international mediation perspective. And here we're drawing on the role of 2 of the main mediators, which are the UN SRSG's office, which is one of them, Ilham being the key person there, as well as Interpeace, which has a long history of research and engagement in Somalia. So to discuss some of these points, one of them was the ability to act at different levels. So while the Galkaio agreement making process largely took place within Galkaio town itself, the mediators were sensitive to the different levels where influence was important. And one of the examples we highlight was the importance of getting an agreement between the heads of the respective states of Puntland and Galmudug. This would not automatically lead to the necessary follow-up on the ground by the states themselves, but gave people like Ilham, gave the mediators the leverage to pursue the process on the ground. And more generally, working at the local level in Galkaio meant linking with the state capitals and the national capitals, as well as with international actors. And the point being that acting locally meant being aware and able to act at other levels too. A second point, particularly interesting, concerns the credibility and identity of international actors in this case. So when we say international, for example, there was a very strong Somali identity within the international actors. And Ilham's role is particularly fascinating in this regard, and we'll hear from her more soon on this. Ilham clearly had a major influence as part of wider local networks supporting the peace process. Khalif was in Garcon a few weeks ago, in fact, with Ilham on another assignment, and he was quite struck by the mark that she had left amongst different people that they met. And Ilham had different hats as a Somali from one side of the border, and from one side of the border by her family identity, as a woman, as a member of the diaspora, and as a UN employee, and actually with little previous experience of this type of mediation. So she had to prove and demonstrate her understanding of the local context and her commitment to the peace efforts. And she clearly did this with great skill and sensitivity, but interestingly, leveraging these different identities that I've just mentioned and their associated resources, whether financial or other, in order to play a critical role in the process. The organisation Interpeace is also important to mention, as they were a significant player locally and brought individuals, one actually a Somali-speaking Swede and another a well-respected elder that had worked for them for many years, and both long-term employees of Interpeace or of its local partners. And they've worked in Somalia for many years and have documented and been part of different peace processes. So international engagement is often problematic. Personal and institutional agendas are often too prominent, and an understanding of an impartiality to the local environment not sufficient. And it can crowd out space for local actors and introduce financial and other incentives that disrupt the process, that are counter to a smooth process. In this case, this is one of our points. The SRSG's office and Interpeace brought an order, a capability, a knowledge, and a commitment, but also stayed in the background as facilitators rather than to try and capture the limelight. Another point, reframing the interests of spoilers. The term spoiler is often used in peace processes, directed at those with interests at odds with the peace process. There were interesting examples provided in doing this research where actual or potential spoilers were given a different way to think about how they could benefit from engaging more constructively in this process. One example was that of a military leader, a military commander who was unwilling to meet his opposite number at a foreign neutral military base. However, he was persuaded that doing so would give him the opportunity to form relations with the foreign forces there, and which would mean he could provide accurate information where he was upset, amongst other things, by an attack on members of his own community who had been targeted using inaccurate information and where a large group of people were killed. And he took up that opportunity once it was framed to him differently. Another point that we wanted to highlight was the inclusive network building and the strengthening of local mechanisms. So this area concern was based on the fact that mediation and facilitation process built on existing structures. After the initial outbreak of conflict in 2015, there was the creation of a joint ceasefire committee. And this committee was expanded through this new engagement to include a much wider set of local actors. Ilham again played an important role in engaging with prominent women and youth groups, thereby also not limiting the process to men and elders alone, whose domain this type of process can remain within. And in addition, other local clans, not from the two major groups, but nonetheless significant to the peace process and part of the local residents of Galkaio town, were brought into the process. So in summary, the 2017 Galkaio Agreement is very important for both Somali society and for state building processes, as well as for international engagement in Somalia and elsewhere. It successfully combined Somali and international actors and resources, and as such we see it as an important example of an appropriate external intervention. It required sensitivity to both the national and local contexts and included a strong Somali identity within the international actors. And this engagement, as embodied by a number of the key mediators working for international agencies, represented what we've called an activist approach to peace building, which was arguably sufficiently powerful to counter underlying grievances and the transactional elite-driven politics that dominate Somalia's political dynamics. And that's an important point that we want to stress, that this activist approach. And finally, the agreement also represents the re-establishment of social relations across what's a really significant border boundary in Somalia, and it's a process that's still ongoing. It remains unfinished and it remains fragile, but things have moved on markedly since December 2017. And this social rebuilding process is qualitatively different than that existed for many years, for 2 or more decades, from 1993, under the Mudug Accord that characterized the pre-existing boundary and the truce that I referred to at the beginning of this talk. So on that note, I shall finish there and hand on to others. Matt, thanks.
Thank you very much. Now we have Ilham Gassar.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Hello, good afternoon. So basically, I think Nisar covered the history of Mudug and Galkaio, and I gave an overview of what the peace building was like. I just wanted to highlight that before, just want to give you a brief background on how I came about. So when I returned to Somalia in 2016 and joined the SRSG's office, Galkaio wasn't the first time I've heard of Galkaio. Galkaio has always been in the houses and households and the discussions among many Somali households. It's often a place where it's referred to for being the funniest city in town, all the jokes and all the stories, all the funny stories that you can relate to are made of Galkaio and come from Galkaio. They're known to be most aggressive individuals, great storytellers, and equally are great leaders. So Galkaio is the production of what they call strong men. It's the city that's known to produce really strong leaders. So before I go into it, for me, coming back to Somalia and joining the UN Political Affairs Office at the midst of an election season, at the midst of everything was kind of happening, and there's different parcels moving and intersecting. The conflict was seen, for me, it was like, we're in 2016, there shouldn't be a mini civil war in Somalia. How can this be happening? We were in the midst of a drought. Many things were happening. So when the ceasefire agreement happened, I was part of a greater team, and the UN has a lot of different units that have been supporting the process, that have been part of the process. And I was fortunate enough to be in the political office as one of the leads that were going into Galkaio and being part of that great team. So my first day of landing in Galkaio was quite significant. Before I left, I asked all the questions and seek support from many colleagues. And I said, look, do you think we can get a peace agreement or a ceasefire to last in Galkaio? And the reaction was almost everyone laughed and said, Galkaio is Galkaio, it's not going to change. There's always been a place of conflict. Those people know nothing more than to kill themselves. So I don't think anything will come out of it. So my first day in Galkaio was I went there with the idea of thinking, what did I get myself into? What is happening? I've always heard of the divided border or the tree that resembles the borderline. So there's a border tree that one talks about. So you go there, you get exchange. However, for me, it was a bit more surreal. I went to a city where everybody was so kind and they interacted really well. They were very welcoming. But at the same time, there was a mental blockade. I went to the tree as an exchange to see where was the border. There was no border. So for me, I pictured an actual physical wall or something of a barrier. Nothing existed. So I realized there is no border. There's mental blockade or in people's mindsets. The hatred was so much of what was said rather than what was happening. And I came to realize it was more to do with the political elites rather than the local people. But because of the identities everybody had, because this notion of the division between Hawi and Daro, because of the divide that existed for so long, there's been no social contract and no social exchanges beyond the fact that you see everybody from Galkaio, they're either cousins or uncles, aunts and aunties, but they're so separate, but part of the same greater family. So one of the key things for me, I think what gave me the breakthrough was the fact that I came without biases. I came to try and prove a point that I can go to Galkaio, that things can change. It doesn't always have to be the negative, a stigma. So for me, it was my own conviction of trying to find the change of rebranding of Galkaio. Can Galkaio be rebranded to the city of peace rather than the city of conflict? So the process took a very long time to kind of process, but I think what was important to the peacemaking agreement is to understand the people, that as international partners, international donors, or international actors, we need to understand that every local conflict, it is very local and nothing can be compared. And nothing that we kind of assume will happen will not happen. It's all about personalities. And for me, the main focus I played focus on was to develop relationship with the people, to understand their own biases and where they're coming from. What is the standoff? What triggers the mayor from the north compared to the mayor from the south? What is the personal connection that can be developed in order to get him to understand that there is there's more benefits to peace than conflict? So for me, I spent a great amount of time invested in the people of Galkaio rather than the process. I think that we are so intertwined with getting things done and following certain sets of rules and ideas that are not often locally processed ideas, that local norms. So saying that, I think peacemaking, it's quite different. I was well over my head thinking that this could, I could be part of a process that succeeds. I remember their initial ceasefire committee mandate was 3 months, let's go in there for 3 months and see if this ceasefire can hold. I saw an opportunity there where there is an opportunity to go beyond the 3 months. There is an opportunity to push and to leverage a bit more and to hold individuals accountable and to get more people involved, because the people were not the issue, it was the political level that was the issue. So, and one thing that it was important to highlight is to be able to navigate within the norms that you operate, to be able to navigate within the institutions that you work are part of. So UNSOM it's great. It has many levels and many different organs that we can tap into for support. However, our own bureaucracy, sometimes it cripples our efforts. But another thing that was really, really important for me was to understand how deep the hatred was, or how deep the conflict was. Like, where is the bottom line of getting things done? And it was a bit naive for me to think that, oh, this is easy, it's simple. But I think it was, and we overthink certain things. And I think once people meet, especially within the Somali culture, we are easy to hate each other from afar. But once you get together and you connect, people often develop a personal relationship that is stronger than their clan identity or political alliances. It's often, if the opportunity can arise, then that's how we go forward. So it was like, the main highlights is individuals who are part of peace processes to acknowledge that this is not just a process. These are social contracts that needs to be forged. These are individuals with personalities and interests. And there was many hot waters I got into. And the key thing that I wanted to kind of highlight was, this is not my peace process. It's not my sustainable conflict solution. It has to be their peace process. It has to be something that they value more than I value. And for me, one of the key things that made the whole process successful was to get our international partners and NGOs aligned. We needed to kind of get together and think, okay, we don't want anybody coming in, spoiling what's happening or creating animosity or people. It's perception. The other individuals are invited to places and creating a deception, right? So it was, once Interpeace and us and others who worked on the process were on the same page, we were able to complement each other and to support the locals into what they wanted. And the other key thing that we succeeded is to make people understand that no matter what happens at the political level, these political leaders or state leaders have their own political interest. It was our job to get them to understand that whatever happens in Galkaio will be your problem. It's a very local problem. It's your household, it's your streets, it's your sons and daughters being affected, and not necessarily the state leaders. So to think beyond the politics, to think on the realm of living together and accepting each other's coexistence. And I think getting individuals to understand that and breaking that barriers and bringing them together was one thing. The other thing that made the peace agreement happen was to involve more stakeholders, is to involve women who have been the backbone of Somali's stability and rebuilding and success in many ways, but get them to understand that there should be no borders. There should be no borders. And on this 8th of March 2017, while there was road blockade and everything still intact and no movement between people and leaders and no exchanges between North and South, we were able to convene 200 women to go across the border to make a statement. And I think when I said, oh, I want to get women together, get them to celebrate together, it was seen as like, no way, you're just going to start a civil war. This is not going to happen. Nobody's going to allow it to happen. But it did happen. And the fact that that happened and they crossed over, it broke down a lot of barriers. And highlights like those, it's what encouraged individuals to get involved. So to get more people involved in the decision-making processes and allowing them to know what's happening and how things can be fostered together was a key thing. And most of the problems in the conflict and grievances in Somalia is often over resources that are very scarce, some don't exist, and the perception of somebody else having more than what you have. And since you can't achieve it, you kind of want to spoil it. So women played a key role. Getting young people involved was another key thing, and supporting them into developing their own actions and invest in their energy, use them in the essence of media, promoting coexistence and positive actions. The other thing that made the agreement work was to hold the media accountable. One thing that was evident was media played a huge role in instigating the conflict and broadcasting some information from one clan to the other. So media accountability was key, and getting everybody to understand that it's best we get more peace dividends by living together in peace and harmony than to fighting each other. And I think although I can't take credit for everything that's happened, I was part of a greater team, and I was part of huge institutions that came with clout, and it gave me the power and opened many doors. So it wasn't seen as Ilhan doing this, it was UN officers who had a vested interest. Yes, it became a personal drive for me, and in more than one way to prove that, putting aside cultural biases and coming with a baggage of, oh, you're a woman, and not only a woman, you are a young woman, you know, how are you going to sit in front of elders? How are they going to accept you? How are they going to welcome you? How can you do this? It was just proving the point that the Somali culture, there is no segregation. And I think women with their own merits are accepted. And I was able to bring individuals who were necessarily not talking to each other at extreme ends together, because I was able to leverage the fact that I was a Somali woman, a Somali sister, who Galkaio was not my city, you know, like technically I'm a guest to both sides. I'm in the Somali context, I'm a guest and I'm a host. And our culture, you don't disrespect your guests. You often are more compliant to your guests, especially if they're women, to kind of listen and give them the benefit of the doubt. So our culture itself enables interaction far beyond than what is deemed to be happening right now. And I think it's one of the significant things to highlight by the agreement is it's one of the agreements, community-led agreements signed by all the subclans that reside within Muduk, not just Galkaio, it's just Galkaio and beyond within Muduk, who have signed with all their clan leads that includes 4 women. And it was never pushed by UN or anybody else. The elders thought it was appropriate to include the women in the process because they were part and party to it. And they realized that this needs to be a wider kind of accommodation of peace for it to sustain. So that itself was significant. And I was really surprised that day when the agreement signed and concluded, there was a ceremony. It's only then that I saw there was female names on the left. And I asked, like, oh, how did this happen? Why did you guys do this? And they were like, no, these women have been part of the re-emergence of Galkayo for many years. They've been part of all the conflicts in Galkayo, and they are part of our peacemaking agreements and restoration of our head system, you know? So when things happen organically, then I think it's more accountable to the people who make it, and it's theirs, and they'll protect it more than if something is foreign to them. So in a nutshell, I think it's important to empower. So there's many people who work in different organizations, including the UN. It's important to have leadership who understands that the complexity of a situation is best suited when the person representing the organization is empowered to do what he or she thinks or deems fit. And I think I had that flexibility and backing by the SRSG and my team. Those are a great team who I've been fortunate to work with, Tomoko and Tare, and they were all providing the adequate support. Them themselves got engaged. So it was a team effort. And I think my personal love and thing of being part of Galkayo, the Galkayo solution. And Galkayo is often known as, if everybody says, if there is a solution to Galkayo and there is a sustainable peace in Galkayo, then the solution to the conflict of the entire nation will be found. So that kind of highlights how significant Galkayo is in the Somali context and to the Somali people. It's referred to as Hudunta Dalka, which means, you know, like literally the umbilical cord of Somalia is right in the center. It's a division of all, and it can be the uniting factor of all that exist. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you very much. That was really interesting. Next, we have Khalif Abdirahman, who will pick up his points.
Okay, hello. Hi, everyone. I think I will concentrate on our experience during the time. Can you hear me well? Yeah. During the time of the visit there, when we were doing the research, first of all, visiting Galkayo as a research site was actually a departure from the norm. Normally, we didn't go there. We thought it was too wild. People were too quick with the guns, and we always avoided that. I think the closest I have been to was Portinle, in research anyway. So this time we were reassured, the least by Ilham, so that we can go and do this research. Departed from reality, from our norm, we went there, and the first thing, it was still not the normal thing we were looking for. In most Somali cities, when you go in, you have one airport you're going to, so you just get your ticket, go there, and go to the airport. But in here, you have two airports: South Galkayo, North Galkayo. I and Ilham didn't know which airport we were going until late. We thought we were going to South Galkayo because we got guys who was from South Galkayo taking us, but the plane ended in North Galkayo. So we thought we will get someone else, but luckily, because it was peace, we got the same guys actually coming from the south and picking us from to the airport. Then we have to also carefully select where we were staying. So the hotel, we stayed in North Galkayo, but most of the time we were working actually in North Galkayo. I could see actually the two sides are still separate. The youth go both sides, but people are not everywhere. If you're in North Galkayo, you know the most of people you have seen are from North Galkayo, and if you're in the south, it's also the same. So people are not intermingling yet. So we're not there yet. So that actually showed us the nature of Galkayo, very apparent. People are still, I mean, this is a place where they see as the epicenter of Somali civil war, the fault line between the main two clans that were fighting most of the time each other, and also a lot of smaller clans that were also fighting each other. However, people of Galkaio are also proud of their 1993 truce between Abdullah Yusuf and Aidid. They are proud because they think this was the only one major truce, that there was no involvement of international community. The two sides came together. But in reality, this was truce only. It wasn't a comprehensive agreement. So they had a truce, they decided to leave together to the city, but there was no resources allocated to keep the peace, or also how they're going to live together. They have decided, and that's why we had a lot of problems. But also, the truce actually held to today. I mean, it have broken a few times, but people were going back to the truce all the time. So it's a fact, something that they can be proud of, that had happened so early and have held for so long. Then there was that truce. There was a fighting in 2015, 2019, 2016, and in 2017 you had the agreement again. Now this time the agreement was different. At least the way the people on the ground saw it, that the difference was that more people were involved. It wasn't between two warlords. It wasn't between elders. It wasn't between two clans. The two major clans were there, or sub-clans, but there were 26 elders altogether from a lot of clans in Galkaio, basically all clans from Galkaio. Also included were different sections of society, so youth, women, who were all proud of being part of this. But then also, there was also allocation of resource in terms of the military, the joint military, and also joint police force that worked on the borders. Because what was happening was that people were able to go and do whatever they commit crimes on the other side. No one was coming after them. So people realized that dealing with that was important. And also the market where they shared, they need someone, one side to keep the security. One side could not keep the security, so they needed to come together. So they had the military keeping security as the state center, where they work together, and also the police force that can cross borders in order to deal with cross-border issues and crimes. Now, the international community have also contributed, not only in the terms of Ilham and the creation of the agreement itself and the pressures, they have done that, but there was also a dividend. So roads were built. I could see the roads. You could see in these roads people taking pictures a lot of times. So it was a new thing. A lot of buildings have sprung up around, tall buildings and nice cafes and hotels around those roads. And people in North Galkaio were saying to me that actually this itself guarantees peace, because before they were dealing, all the people who had money and had to protect it, the projects were in Mogadishu already from South Galkaio. So now they have brought their money back to South Galkaio, and they have something to shoot back at. Therefore, the other side will be careful about this. So that the fact that there was buildings that sprung around those roads built by the international community itself is like a peace insurance itself also. For a long time, since 1998, there was a system, Puntland, on one side. On the other side, did not have anything. So there was chaos against the system. Puntland itself is not that systematic, really, but you have at least a government that can override the elders, that can stop the forces. But in here, you didn't have that. So you have a lot of problems. The creation of Galmudug, actually, even though Puntland itself opposed, have actually changed it a lot, and especially the last election. So what happened in the last election was organizing the society on this side and correct the inequalities that existed between the two sides. So now you have two systems. The elders are still there, but the two systems are much stronger. So there's no plans. People talk about the peace agreements, the way they want to support it. In reality, there's no clear plan from any side. But you at least have two ecosystems that are trying to work together. But in reality, also the two systems are not Galkaio centric, so they center somewhere else. So they could be also have a problem. The creation of Galmudug actually have strengthened the agreement of 2017 in many ways. And this is what happened. I mean, people, when there was agreement, during the agreement, there was more than 10 people killed. So the elders have to say jointly we will pay together the dia or the compensation for those people. But now they're dealing with the people who were killed after the agreement, clan by clan. So you have springing off from this agreement, a clan agreement that's driven down the society. So for example, each two clans are now making agreement of their own, of the people who died since then, and are trying to underline and go forward. So the business is not finished. Started in 2017, it's still continuing, supported by, in a sense, by the international agreement, international community, which I think now the resources are dried up in a sense, but the states are coming in and pushing it further. The society seems to be very positive and think that that was something very good and it needs keeping. It's except that when you say how you're going to do this, they don't have much plans. Everyone have his own plan, so they're not working together in and they're not organized. So the international community helps, but also we have to say also sometimes also actually hinders, because if you look, there's military there supported by the Americans, for example, and they're so focused on anti-terror, which means if there is an incident that might kill 200 people here, but it's a clan warfare, they might not see that's important. If they see one person who is suspect terrorism, that they will move the earth to do that, and what that makes it a problem. When you listen to them, sometimes they do things even help actually the agreement simply because it helps them in their anti-terror fight. So when you have international community that's actually focused only on one thing, but this peace is actually needs multiple things. Definitely combating terrorism is one of it, but it's not all of it. So it's important that the international community understands this and takes. And they did tell us that sometimes when they help something that was not actually to do with, it helps them in their also anti-terror fight. So a cross-section of Galkaio society is actually very optimistic about the future of the city and of Mudug region. It's just that when you ask why, they all think it has been good last 3 years and it ought to be good, better even in the next 3 years. But how will that happen? They also do not know. But I can say definitely that the vast majority of them that we have interviewed are very optimistic about the future of Mudug, which they expect it to be one day the capital of Somalia, because it's at the center and at the center of the clans that are major clans in Somalia. And they think its people are entrepreneurs and in politics are very dominant. Therefore, one day this will be so peaceful, the capital will move from Mogadishu to them. Let's hope that will become a truth. But also the reality is, by the day I was leaving, 4 men were killed in front of my hotel. It didn't look that as anything have happened in Galkaio. And the 4 men were all killed as a wrong identity. Someone was trying to have a revenge on clan and fired, and they were all the wrong men. So that could actually start little wars as well, which can come into a big war. So you can see the volatility, but also the optimism is important, actually. I will leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much, Khalif. And finally, we have Mark, who's next.
Thank you very much, Matt. And thanks very much to LSE for inviting me to participate in this meeting. I've read the briefing paper and I had some privileged access to the longer report. So it's given me some other sort of insights into the Galkaio peace process. I mean, first of all, congratulations to LSE and Nisar and his colleagues for producing this study. There has, as Nisar noted, been an interest in sort of subnational local peace processes, peace building processes. I'm not sure it's a recent turn, as you phrased it. I mean, I think the interest in this goes back many years, sort of post 1990, end of the Cold War, weakening of state sovereignty, globalization. I think all these sort of processes that have been going on since then have given some greater interest in these sort of subnational processes. So I don't think it's particularly new. And I've been part of studies myself in Somalia going back to the early 90s, and also in South Sudan, actually going back 20 years now, I guess, in local peace processes. But I think this is an important and a useful and also a timely study that adds to the literature and our understanding of local peace processes. And it's important because, as you've all said, Galkaio, that part of Somalia, has been the sort of epicenter of conflict in Somalia for a long time, even going back before the Civil War. So that's why this agreement is particularly important. I think it's a useful report and a study, partly because it builds on previous studies in the descriptions of the processes, and it describes and indicates that some lessons have been learned from past processes as well. And I think I'll say a bit more about that later. But it's also, I think it's a very timely report, in part because of the upcoming election process. And a key meeting around the current election processes took place in Dusamareb in Galgaduud earlier this year. And I guess that was only possible because of the success of the 2017 Galkaio agreement, which was largely about creating conditions for the establishment of Galmudug as a federal member state and as part of the peace building, state building process in Somalia. And I think the links between the political and conflict dynamics in Mogadishu and those in the central rangelands of Somalia has long been recognized. And indeed, that conflict that led to the intervention, that led to the forging of this peace agreement in 2017 was in part sparked by as Nisar mentioned, the sort of maneuvering around the election process at that time. If that peace process had failed in Galmudug, maybe Galmudug, we may not have that sort of stability today that has allowed the Dusamareb conference to happen. So it's a reminder of what also the sort of long-term impacts of some of these peace agreements can be as well. I guess the real congratulations, though, should go to those who were really instrumental in forging the peace agreement in Galkaio. Of course, Ilham, as we know, was very key in that as a chief negotiator. The SRSG Keating's office clearly played an important role as is described in the report, and also Interpeace, as has been mentioned. And really, I think they should, it's a shame they're not on this call, because I think they would have a lot to contribute, perhaps more than myself. I mean, I didn't follow this process itself at the time, so perhaps I can take a bit of a step back from it as an observer of other peace processes in Somalia and Somaliland, and in particular, maybe reflect on a piece of work that I did with Interpeace, which was mentioned, which was this peace mapping study in 2007. And the idea behind that study at the time was to try and shift thinking in international responses to Somalia away from the sort of focus on international mediated national peace talks, which had at the very least a sort of challenging history, to an interest in local peace processes, which had at that point, I think, proven more durable, in Somaliland and in Puntland than the international mediated processes. And also a shift of thinking away from just doing conflict analysis to doing peace analysis, as it were, trying to understand these local processes. So, the premise of that study was that, conflict assessments had become a very sort of common practice among aid organizations, other organizations working in countries in conflict, in order to understand those drivers and dynamics of armed violence. And it was much less common to see assessments about how societies also adapt to conflict, how people manage their security, how they try and reconstruct viable ways of life. And I think the understanding of those conditions and processes, and also some of the costs by which people would try to reduce conflict, I think was we felt was equally important, and also potentially a starting point for diplomatic interventions, and also for foreign aid policies. So that peace mapping study that we did with Interpeace set out to study those local processes and also to contrast them with the international mediation. And so, some of our key questions are about why the international diplomatic initiatives had seemed to have been unable to help establish a functional government, and why some of these local peace processes in the Somali regions have proven to be more sustainable than the international ones. And the study, Interpeace colleagues, they researched well over 100 local peace processes. I mean, I think there were 90 processes alone that they looked at in Jubaland, and there were another sort of 30 processes in Somaliland that they researched, and similar numbers in Puntland and elsewhere, some of which succeeded, had positive outcomes, and some of which were less. And it also looked at international mediation efforts between 1991 and 2004, and drew up a set of findings. And I went back and looked at those, having read your briefing paper and your report, and I thought it was interesting to reflect on them, and what some of the findings of that report were. So, obviously one of the main findings was Somalis were very adept at or as adept and as engaged in making peace as they were in fighting each other. And one of the other things that kept coming across was the importance of so-called Somali ownership, which I think is a bit of a sort of overused word, but I think what we broke that down to mean when we were looking at these local peace processes is that they were, locally designed, they were locally mediated, they were locally managed, and they were largely locally financed as well. They included representation that was considered legitimate. They were locally selected representatives in those meetings. They had long time frames and were flexible. Some of them ran over months. They all took place within the Somali regions. They drew on traditional mechanisms for consensus building and conflict resolution, like the HARE that we have Ilham talked about in the Galkaio process. There were systems for reparation, which were really important for sustaining those agreements. They had systems for sanctions against spoilers, those who broke those agreements. There were great efforts to make them very inclusive, involving broad public participation. There were great efforts to disseminate those proceedings and the outcomes of those meetings to ensure that there was some kind of popular endorsement of those agreements. And they also established transitional mechanisms to oversee the implementation of those agreements. And of course, there were, in many ways, the sort of objectives of those agreements were about rebuilding social relations. So quite different in terms of the objectives, perhaps, of the international mediated efforts, which were about trying to help mediate or forge a deal, a power sharing deal between different parties, rather than trying to transform the conflict itself. And so those characteristics of those locally owned, those local Somali peace processes contrasted quite starkly with the international ones. I won't go into the details of those, but one of the interesting aspects of the briefing paper and the report was not so much the international external mediation, although clearly important, but was that how many of these principles that were apparent in these local Somali peace processes were also there in the case of Galkaio. And I guess it suggested a couple of things to me. One, as the CRP report also notes, that some lessons have been learned, that the experience and knowledge that Interpeace and others brought to the process was very important. I mean, partly based on the peace mapping study, I guess, but also their long history and their deep knowledge of what can work in Somalia was clearly important. And also, it seemed to me that the international actors had also learned something. One of the questions I think that was left hanging for us in the peace mapping study was about this question about how do you bring the local, as it were, and the national and the international together. And I think that comes out strongly in the Galkaio process, because it seems to have worked. And of course, in addition to the particular individuals that were involved, which the report stresses, there were clearly common interests between the international community and the sort of state building, the federalization process, and the interests of those actors on the ground. And there was a recognition of that relationship between the local dynamics in Galkaio and those in Mogadishu. So that linking the local and the national, I think, was very understanding that was very key. And I think it will be very interesting, as I said, because this is a timely report, to see how the current election process plays out in Galkaio, and what kinds of strains it may place on that the Galkaio peace agreement. I mean, Khalif referred to a few issues around that there doesn't seem to be the sort of active efforts to maintain or sustain that agreement in Galkaio at the moment. And I would think that that is something that Somalis and the international community should keep an eye on. I think maybe I will leave it at that, but maybe just one other thing just to add, and that relates to something that Khalif said, is that the process in a sense is not over yet. There is an ongoing process, and I think it's the Political Settlement Research Program came up with a term unsettlement rather than political settlement, and a lot of these processes are in a state of unsettlement, as they're not necessarily final. And so I think whether they ever can be final is a question in itself. But I think if there is another lesson to draw from the past, is that it's the international community tends to be a little bit fickle in these contexts, is that they're very interested in it at some point, and then interests move on elsewhere. So I guess the question is, how does one sustain the efforts and the achievements that were made in 2017 through the Galkaio peace process going forward? I'll leave it to that. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much to all of our presenters. I have just wanted to say that it's been fantastic to hear everything, and we'll now open up the floor to questions from the audience. Now, I've already been fielding several questions that have come through, and so perhaps I'll go ahead and throw some of them out. But if people continue to address them, I'll continue to try and filter them out to everyone. So there are a few foundational questions which emerged, which I'll start with those first, and then we'll move to kind of questions around resources and the role they play, and other kind of conflict drivers which have emerged, or maybe spoilers, or leading to sort of political unsettlement and things. So Christine Seifert has asked, how do you measure the success of the agreement? And could you elaborate a bit more on the activist approach to peace building? So that was, I think I'll field a few just now on foundation. So another one that emerged was from Abdi Fattah Duhulo Lau. So though the solution of Somalia lies within the Somalis, can the panels define what it is peace before we think of a solution? So I think conceptualizing peace, is there a conceptualization of peace that people have? And I'll leave that. Well, there's, I suppose, Ismail Jamale has asked another question which sort of relates to this too, and sort of saying, what kind of mediators does Somali peace processes need? External impartial mediators or internal partial mediators? So I think those are the kind of foundational questions, and I'll leave that at that for now to throw out to everyone, and then we'll return to some of the questions around resources. Does anyone want to, I don't think whoever wants to dive in first is perhaps the way to go.
Shall I have a first go?
Please do.
Yep. I think, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think we've had comments from Mark and myself on it. What do we mean by, what conceptualizing peace, and what do we mean by peace? And I think, I mean, as well as a kind of absence or a relative absence of violence, particularly compared to the past, one of the most important things about this agreement, and in some of the literature that Mark spoke about, Khalif talked about this, Ilham talked about this, is the rebuilding of social relations. And I think that perhaps is really critical and marked a difference between, as we said, between the 93 Accord and this process, which is still ongoing. So I guess the rebuilding of social relations across a border area is highly significant. And you would hope that the fact that the peace process is still evolving, and as Khalif pointed out, there are incidents, maybe these are more kind of criminal incidents, it's still holding, it's being sustained, and a large part of that sustainability is the fact that it was a very inclusive process and it involved a rebuilding of social relations. So I don't know whether others would like to comment on that aspect. What is success?
So I will have a go at answering, Christine. Is the peace agreement successful? I think very hard to measure. I think that we're still in the state of making peace, and peace process is still ongoing. Measuring success is far too early. We'll see how it goes. But so far, the fact that people's connections and connectivity have been restored, that can be seen as a success. However, what's needed is not just peace building or mediation. What's needed is systems and governance in place and structures of government and extension of state authority that goes beyond the state capitals. Once those are restored, I think then we can see and measure how successful the peace agreement has become and how can it be elaborated a bit more. So if that answers your question.
Okay, there was another one that I think came in just as I asked that, which is from Mizuki Takahashi, who's asked, what do you think when basically is the end point of a peace agreement and peace building in this Galkaio peace process? So I think we're just going to start with some very difficult questions in the beginning, and then we'll break it down to some of the more questions around resources as they come. So I'll just throw that out there because it does relate to that, if anyone wants to be bold enough to talk about that.
Maybe can I just point the finger at Khalif, actually, because he's been following, and there have been more subsequent interclan peace agreements that have been developing since that 2017 one. So Khalif, maybe you want to indicate or say a few words about how there's a succession of agreements taking place.
Yeah, it's refinement of agreement, actually. But in reality, if you look at this, it's not a conflict between two states. It's not a conflict between two large populations. It's the absence of a state itself, and it is apparatus, security apparatus, it's justice, policing, everything being absent is creating actually this conflict itself. And I believe unless we have effective state, we are going to have this conflict, and we're going to be talking about conflict resolution. Because if you look at it, most of the conflict starts from a simple crime. Someone killed someone, someone stole the cows of someone. These are things that normally are dealt with the police, but the police is not there. So the clan then comes in, the other clan comes in then. So I think the end game have to be a state that's functional. That's it for me.
Maybe I could just add on the question about how do you define peace, which maybe also relates to the question about success of the agreement or of a peace agreement. I mean, Nisar talked about the importance of sort of rebuilding social relations, and that I think was very central to a lot of Somali-run peace processes that I've studied in the past. But I guess it raises quite an interesting question because about political settlements, because we talk about there being a sort of political settlement in Somalia at the moment based on a particular set of variables, including the sort of 4.5 formula and elections and constitutions and things, but where in that political settlement is there any sense of rebuilding social relations? And so is that only something that happens at a local level, or is it also something that can happen at a national level as part of that sort of national political settlement? I mean, Nisar mentioned, sort of different definitions of peace, like the sort of absence of violence. I mean, I think other issues around equity, one could look at, and I think the report talks about how there's been a sort of rebalancing of that in Galkaio between the north and the south, as different resources have come in at different times. And I think the other thing about, is there question it might raise is there ever peace anyway? Because I think the dynamics of, are always changing. The war in the 1990s in Somalia, and the kind of conflicts that were happening then is very different to the kind of conflicts that are happening now in Somalia. So, would you apply the same descriptions of states of conflict and peace in the early 90s and states of conflict and peace in the 2000s? That doesn't answer the question, it just raises more.
I'd like to also just come in on the point of the question about what do we mean by an activist approach, actually, because I think this is really also central to some of the work that actually we do within the CRP, but that brings up a bit of a tension between an activist approach, which you would typically say it's about a project or an initiative that is very personalized. It becomes a very personal project, and there's a tension with institutional positions, and the institutions come with their security protocols, they come with their bureaucratic procedures. And one of the striking things in doing this piece of work, talking to a lot of different people, is, and I can think of 3 different organizations where you have to break the rules. You have to break different types of rules, organizational rules, because you're so invested, personally invested in a project. It's not just a job, it's part of a deep commitment that people feel. And I think that is a difficult thing to overcome, but some of the people that were involved in this peace process did comment on the constraints. I think Ilham referred to it herself, that there are these different constraints which bureaucracies and organizations bring that are not always conducive to demonstrating to local people that you are invested locally, that where local people are living that conflict and are facing those dangers. And if you're just acting within the kind of limited constraint, what can be very limited constraints of your organization, this becomes problematic. And this wouldn't necessarily just apply to the area of peace building, but you could apply it to lots of different ways in which international organizations, NGOs, UN are engaged in places like Somalia. They often become very separate from the local context and from building relations with local people. So I think it's a really, really important issue, and I think it's a really difficult one to resolve. Actually, the limits of organizations and institutions with the possibilities of what you can do acting as an individual outside of those or beyond those constraints. I don't know what, maybe I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that.
No one else wants to comment. We've got some more difficult questions, so get ready. So I think there's the other kind of round of questions loosely center on what the conflict drivers are, and I'll divide these into 2 parts. But the first batch of them, one of which goes, I think it's from Abdi Fateh Duholo again, and it's a request saying, if the international community is understood to be spoilers, as the first panel speaker illustrated, when the panel members, is it possible that outside solutions will ever create viable solutions to Somalia's problems, if I can summarize that question? So is external intervention ever going to meaningfully resolve Somalia's challenges? There's another question from Chris Langdon, which is directed towards Ilhan, which says that Ilhan referred to the negative role of the media. How was that addressed? Are there examples of the media playing a positive role? And then I have a sort of 2-part question, which I'm going to combine from 2 questioners. The first is from Ahmed Shire, asking, communities in Madogo are mobilizing resources, millions of dollars, and they're competing to build port infrastructure in Gorkad and Hobyo, Indian Oceans. Will such projects contribute to the peace or cause another layer of conflict in Galkaio and the larger Madogo region? And then there's another question, which I think also relates, interestingly, to kind of infrastructure, although this time in relation to buildings and hotels, from Subhan Jama, who says that they found Khalif's observations about the buildings and hotels springing up across Galkaio as a sort of peace assurance of sorts. Although Subhan has just returned from Galkaio and was particularly encouraged to see young people from each side traveling back and forth across the border to visit these new establishments, and argues that this is perhaps a positive observation about how local investment can operate as a boon to local peace. So I think there's a question about resources there, and I'll leave it at that. There's some more that'll be raised as well.
So I'll go straight in and answer the media-related question. So media played a negative role. The way we kind of compacted was to identify what was happening. So the first precaution that we took was we invited all the media outlets, providers, and I think it was TIS Plus who were kind enough to do the training. So there's media training offered to them, and after the media training, they were made to kind of forbids them from reporting or instigating, not reporting, but basically forbid them from instigating violence or inciting violence or promoting conflict within the clans. And the two state leaders agree that any media outlet which kind of instigates or promotes violence will lose their license. Some refer to us as saying that's like against media rules and media laws, but it wasn't. It was just prevention of conflict and prevention of losses of lives. So that's one of the measures that we have taken. And they actually, after the training and putting media outlets in one room to kind of communicate, because if you think about it, Galkaio was not only divided by the people, there were separate media outlets operating north and south and not necessarily sharing information and communicating. So it's a competition of who releases defaming words and allegations to the other. So like that kind of compacted and put across the vision of the people, which was to promote peace rather than to promote conflict. The other question from in terms of regarding resources, hobby port and Garad port, I think that's a positive investment. What's happening and what Somalis are known to be very entrepreneurial. You know, the relative peace Galkaio has had for the past 3 years has attracted many retainees to come and invest and develop and build houses. It's one big, massive construction site. There's a lot of things happening, and it's encouragement to see that relative peace can create space for investment from actually the diaspora, locals, and there is intersection between the two. So although there is still a relative divide, there is interactions. So you're able to go north to south and explore different hotels in different areas. Youth are going beyond the city and then going to the rural areas on Fridays and getting together. So there's a high economic development is key, and economic interaction is also a very important thing. I just wanted to highlight that the division not only created segregation amongst people, there was also segregated kind of in terms of economical terms. There's different police in different structures, everything that exists in Galkaio exists in two. We have 2 mayors, 2 governors, 2 of everything, and it's one small city. So now what the agreement has enabled was a working relationship between the 2 offices. Although there are 2 separate administrations, there is an element of sharing information and working together and sharing resources at times of difficulties. When there was a fire in the South Galkaio, the fire brigades came from North Galkaio. So that never used to happen. It was, this is one of those encouraging things. And it's actually encouraging and making people have the hopes and dreams of creating Galkaio as one unified city that comes directly under the federal. I mean, that's a conversation we're not yet to have, and Somalia is not ready for yet, but it's one of those things that when you speak to the locals, that comes out.
Do others want to dive in, or we do have a few more questions, although we may be running out of time?
Maybe I could just, sorry.
Go ahead, Mark.
Well, no, just a couple of thoughts on the question about whether the international community can ever meaningfully resolve conflict. I mean, I think it depends what we mean by resolve a conflict. And it seems that in the case of the Galkaio agreement, the international community played a useful and important role, but it really depends what you're trying to resolve. I mean, one of the things I think that my reading of the study is that the conflicts that we were sort of dealing with in Galkaio are around issues of sort of governance and resources. But as a region of Somalia, there are many other issues there. Land, environmental change, urbanization, lots of other dynamics that are happening there that can also feed into conflict, process changes in livelihood patterns. I mean, new infrastructure and things. All of this have the potential to, to both, I guess, stabilize the place, but also provoke conflict. So I think it depends what it is that one's trying to resolve. I think if one thinks back to Puntland and Somaliland, I think what was very important in the processes there was actually having that political agreement, and which brought a certain level of stability and a reduction in armed violence that then I think allowed other economic processes and social processes to happen. So I think if the international community has helped in Galkaio to bring about that political agreement, then to some extent, yes, I would say they have helped to resolve that conflict. It doesn't mean that it's going to stay like that forever, or that other issues are not pertinent. But if one looks at the importance of that sort of political settlement, then it seems that they contributed there.
And just to add, like the role the international partners played within the Galkaio process was a facilitation role. They were able to kind of bring individuals together and facilitate rather than the lead. And you're right, Mark, the political agreement is what cracked open all these kind of avenues and gave us opportunities to kind of push through and see what can be achieved by the locals by giving them the power and tools to kind of take the process on. I just wanted to answer Adam Matan's question of, are there any plans to institutionalize these agreements to ensure sustainability? The agreements were done in conjunction with the Minister of Interior, Federal Minister of Interior. And everything has been documented by the committee. I mean, like the agreement is held by elders. The elders are consist of 36, and within 36, there's an executive branch. There's always been a form of documenting and expanding the agreement. So right now, there's other processes going on that's building on what was achieved amongst the Mudug elders and going towards the east and the western side of Mudug. So it's an elaboration of it's a starting point, and it's a starting point to get the culture of writing things down, institutionalizing it. Maybe the Ministry of Interior is documenting. One of the key individuals who played a leading role is the current Minister of Interior, Puntland. He was one of the key stakeholders at the time. He wasn't a minister. This is Mohammed Dabanad. He played a key role in facilitating, going beyond his civil duties to kind of help bring the two sides together, to kind of forge an agreement and to document and dictate what was going to be written by the elders. So a lot of individuals with their own capacities played a role to make sure that the piece was owned by them. And I'll leave it at that. Hopefully it answers Adam's question.
Okay, I think there are still a few more questions, which are very big, but I think we may have to wrap it up here, just because we are literally right on the edge of everything. So I just want to thank everyone very much for coming. It's been a really fascinating discussion, and I think there's going to be a lot more. And so basically, I just want to thank all of our participants for making the time, and also everyone who's been able to attend this virtually, either on Zoom or on Facebook. Thank you very much, and we look forward to hosting you sometime soon. So we'll give sort of a virtual round of applause to everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.